Michael Sass-Rolfes. He's an independent conservation economist, I guess PhD student or master's student at the Oxford University, and his talk is going to be reviewing the evidence that legal trade can reduce pressure on wild populations of trafficked endangered species. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'd also like to thank the organizers for inviting me here today. I'm going to address more or less the same question, but hopefully in a slightly less technical and less theoretical way. Okay, just because I don't have a logo next to my name, just a quick little bit of background on me. I'm a conservation economist. I've been working in the conservation arena applying economic analysis for a couple of decades. I've been looking at rhino markets and trade policy for about 25 years. I've also done some work on the ivory trade and the ivory stockpile issue, and looked at other species like tigers and bears. So to address this first question, can legal trade ever assist with conserving wild populations of species? The answer is yes. And the two classic examples that are trotted out are crocodilians, the crocodile trade, and the South American vicuña, which initially was subject to a trade ban, but then trade was reopened, and it's turned out to be a big conservation success story. We also have the example of ostriches, and there are others, but not always. And then a classic case of a crocodilian species that hasn't gone so well is the Siamese crocodile, and then the abalone trade in South Africa, where legal trade didn't seem to help at all, and a lot of marine species. And what about elephants, tigers, bears? You read a lot of speculation. There have been attempts to trade legally in elephant, tiger, and bear products in Asia, the one of ivory sale and so on. But if you really get into it, the results are ambiguous. There's not sufficient conclusive data. We don't really know what effects these legal trade attempts have had. So the bottom line is, it's complicated, as you will have gathered from the previous presentation. But I've been involved in a study which has a collaborative study with the IUCN Sustainable Use and Livelihoods Group, together with the International Trade Center. And we've looked at a whole suite of species and tried to tease out what are the conditions that will determine whether something will be successful or not. And what you very quickly find out is that every single species is different, and that situations even vary within species. And so we've teased out a bunch of relevant factors here. There are biological, ecological factors. There are technological factors relating to harvesting and management techniques, and obviously these change over time. Institutions are critically important, institutions being the rules of the game. Property rights, tenure, customs, culture, regulations, political systems, governance issues, basically. Trade structure, again, the previous speaker mentioned this. What is the structure of the supply chain? Are there monopolies along the supply chain? Is there competition? How is it structured? And finally, what is the nature of demand? What is the size of demand? How persistent is it? Just the biological factors, there are a whole lot. I won't run through them: species distribution, diet specificity, rates of growth, abundance, so on. Technological factors, harvesting techniques and costs, very important, both for legal producers and illegal producers. Lethal versus non-lethal harvesting. Can the product be harvested non-lethally? If so, you've got a distinct advantage. There's the question of wild harvest versus intensive production. Most examples of successful legal trade will involve some intensification or domestication, or, if you will, farming. Is this possible? Is it technically feasible? And the ability to monitor and protect, and the costs of doing that. Then institutional issues. Do the laws in place match relevant customs and culture? How strong are ownership rights and tenure on the ground where they matter? Rights create incentives. Rights are critically important. We all know that open access is a major problem, as exemplified by the classic paper by Garrett Hardin, The Tragedy of the Commons. Institutions also create market structures, including black markets. Bans actually can create black markets. So I'm just framing this slightly differently from the previous speaker, but if you look at the literature, you see there are two levels of argument for legal trade, and mostly you'll see what I call the first or weaker argument for legal trade. And it goes something like this. It's a supply-side driven effect, which says, if it's, again, simple supply and demand economics, if you increase the supply of a good from legal sources, all other things being equal, the illegal price and therefore poaching will drop. And this is the philosophy behind dumping stockpiles onto the market. You hear expressions like flooding the market. So it's the idea behind one-off sales being useful for conservation. But there are a lot of problems with this approach. The economist Ted Bergstrom was one of the first proponents of this approach, and he questioned the wisdom of confiscating stockpiles and hanging on to them or destroying them. He said you should actually just resell the confiscated stocks and reinvest the money into conservation. But of course this is not allowed under CITES, so this is something that's not actually possible. The other problem that he didn't look at is the signaling issue. What message does it send out to the marketplace if you resell confiscated items? The other problem with dumping on one-off sales is that you have short-term versus long-term effects, and you might have strategic responses from speculators. That's what the Haldermania and Bilt paper is about. The strong argument for legal trade says that if you have strong property rights, owners and custodians can benefit directly from sales and reinvest them into protection and breeding. And this is the reason why domestic animals like cows and chickens are in no danger of extinction. So if you had to introduce legal trade progressively and appropriately, the combined gradual effect of increasing the supply and the added protection that you would be able to get from earning profits could eventually displace illegal market activity by making it less profitable. So there are counter-arguments again. One of the counter-arguments is that, well, if you legalize, you might send out a message to the marketplace that this is now acceptable. You could remove a previous stigma effect, and you could get a market expansion effect, which would then negate the price effect. Another problem also referred to earlier is laundering, which again would the possibility for laundering product would undermine this displacement effort. And then obviously there are a lot of problems revolving around intensification, the animal welfare concerns, health concerns, product differentiation concerns. There are possible ways to mitigate this. In terms of the market expansion effect, consumer engagement, demand management, I prefer to use that expression than demand reduction. Certification and tracking, there are technologies that could work for certain species and products. And then to address the intensification problem, there are cases where free-range production would work perfectly well, and the setting of standards, norms and standards. So where is there a case for legal trade? And I'm just looking at pachyderms right now, but the strongest case, if you look at the spectrum, is for the southern white rhino in South Africa and Namibia. And the weakest case is for unmanaged elephant populations in Central Africa. So in a nutshell, that would be the easiest one to do. That would be a lot harder and would probably require cross-subsidization from the previous one, and that would be the hardest. And yeah, say no more. I also want to address 4 common misconceptions surrounding all these debates. The first is that illegal trade always causes illegal killing. The second is that trade fuels demand. The third is that it is always cheaper to obtain from illegal sources over legal ones because poaching costs are low. And the fourth one is that wild products are always preferred over farmed. And these are things you regularly see in the literature. So to address the first one, there are definitely instances where illegal trade of existing stocks may satisfy demand and prevent future price increases, thereby reducing illegal killing. If you look at all the ivory and rhino horn stockpiles lying around, if those were sold into the market, it may well meet some of the demand. And I'd like you just to take a look at this graph. You saw it in Tom Milliken's graph earlier as well. If you look at that period from 2003 to 2008, that's a very interesting time. This is in South Africa. There was a lot of illegal activity happening during that period, but it was technically legal within South Africa. The horn was leaking onto the market from domestic sales and from pseudo-hunting. What happened, though, that was clamped down on in 2008 and 2009 with 2 pieces of legislation in South Africa. And you can see the response of the market to that. So whatever illegal activity was going on there, it was nevertheless sustainable because the money earned by the game ranchers was being reinvested into rhino conservation. So even though it was technically illegal, it was not bad for rhinos. It didn't cause illegal killing. To address the second argument that trade or supply fuels demand, well, no, illegal trade meets demand. If there's no willing buyer, there would be no trade. We've analyzed, in terms of legal trade, we've analyzed some statistics relating to alligator trade and found absolutely no correlation with trade levels and demand. Demand is actually what drives things, not trade. So the cause and effect is often confused. Legal trade could also affect demand either way, depending on whether which market effect is greater, the expansion effect or the substitution effect. Is poaching always cheaper? No. This is not true in the case of existing stockpiles. It's obviously cheaper to sell stockpiles that you have on hand. Also, with farming, there are increasing returns to scale. So over time, it becomes cheaper to farm relative to illegal supply. And conversely, poaching costs also increase as either animals become scarcer or better protected. So these things are moving in opposite directions, and there might be an acceptable point where they meet. And if we look at what's happening at the moment in South Africa, the prices that we are recording that are being paid to poachers are actually extremely high. And the prices of moving stuff across international boundaries are not inconsequential either. What some of these other papers, the assumption they make is that poaching is almost costless. Not true. The argument that wild is preferred over farmed, again, this is very simplistic and not always correct. Quality and certification methods could favor farmed products. And if we look, there's a spectrum of examples. In the case of bear bile, we know that wild bear bile is of higher quality and preferred over farmed bile. With tiger and lion bone, not as clear. With rhino horn, if you were producing them from free-range rhinos, I don't see any reason why the market would distinguish between the two. And with tiger skins, we know that farmed tiger skins fetch higher prices because they're better quality than wild skins, which tend to be scratched and in poorer condition. So when do bans work? Bans typically work well in the short term, with larger visible products and when they enjoy strong and widespread public support, especially, crucially, from consumers and local people on the supply side. So it doesn't really matter what we think in this room here, it matters what people think on the ground in Africa and on the ground in the Asian consumer markets. When do bans fail? They fail in the long term if demand persists, because black markets and corruption inevitably move in. They fail with low public support and high transactions costs. If the costs of enforcing these things are too high, eventually governments will give up, and we will see low political will. And we're in severe danger of that in Southern Africa, of just plain burnout. Bans will also fail when you have a combination of highly inelastic supply and inelastic demand. And the Nobel Prize-winning economist wrote an excellent piece, Gary Becker wrote an excellent piece about this, which explains why alcohol prohibition could never work, why the war on drugs could never work. And we potentially could be looking at a situation like that with rhino horn. Why do bans fail? Because there are no incentives for local people. It devalues the resource at its source, except for criminals. It only places value on the resource for criminals. We also have the problem on the demand side that illegal products can confer status. If you, in some Asian markets, it shows that you have guangxi, you have high social standing. If you're able to acquire an illegal product, it means you're beyond the reach of the law. This is a real challenge. And I would argue that you can't always centrally control a fundamentally decentralized problem, which is what this global illegal wildlife trade is. Just a few comments about rhinos. South Africa and Namibia have arguably been the most successful models for rhino conservation. They do harbor most of the world's remaining rhinos. And this is largely, my analysis is this is largely due down to their sustainable use policies, of which commercial trophy hunting played a very large part. And the profits and the market that drove the private ownership of rhinos and commercial hunting also fed into the state park system, because the state parks sold rhinos into the private sector. So the whole system was fueled by that commercial use. And in these countries, you have strong institutions, private property rights, strong community rights, and also strong state institutions, independent parastatal organizations who are appropriately incentivized. Just something to think about. Since 2007, some 2,750 rhinos have been poached in South Africa. This represents approximately 11 tons of horn. This is a guess. These are just, these are crude estimates, but this is a good enough crude estimate. If we can believe the average figures that we've been receiving over the last few years, that would fetch the retail value of those 11 tons would have been about 400 million pounds. All of that money financed criminals. So consider that we had all this time, and we still have more than 11 tons of rhino horn in existing stockpiles. Private producers can produce at least 2 tons a year sustainably. And that capturing just a portion of this 400 million, we were talking about funding shortages earlier on, would have made a massive difference to rhino protection and conservation efforts generally. So the question is, did these interventions actually make sense? I'm deeply concerned that rhinos are heading towards becoming a domestic animal, trade or no trade. A few comments about elephants. The past one-off sales under CITES were poorly set up as an elephant conservation measure. The market structure was inappropriate. All the profits were concentrated in the middle. The intermediaries made all the money. They bought low, they sold high. That does not meet the objectives of the strong case for legal wildlife trade at all. You're not incentivizing the producers, and you're not bringing down the price to consumers. So you're allowing the illegal market to compete. You're giving them an incentive to compete. The other problem is there was uncertainty about when ivory was going to come onto the market again. Irregular, uncertain supply causes speculation. Now, very contentious issue, ivory stockpiles, what to do with them. The fact is, ivory stockpile destruction makes no economic sense as a blanket policy. You're taking a valuable resource and you're destroying it, a resource that could yield value that you could reinvest into something. That's just from an economic perspective. However, if demand persists, destroying stockpiles also makes no conservation sense because it's going to drive up prices and it's going to lead to more poaching. The critical question here is, does stockpile destruction affect demand? The theory is, destroy the stockpiles, send out a message to the marketplace. But the question is, what message are you sending to the marketplace? Will consumers look at this and say, oh, we won't buy ivory because they're destroying it? Or will speculators look at this and say, oh, there's going to be less ivory, it's a scarcer resource, it's going to be more valuable, it's a resource that's going to increase in value in time, let's buy more. So to avoid potential black market price increases, demand reduction should precede supply restriction. And ideally, and I know what the limitations are here, but ideally we should monitor the effects of current destructions before going any further. Otherwise, we are violating the precautionary principle by not leaving our options open. 3 final points. On the supply side, livelihoods are critical, so give local people incentives. On the demand side, engage with consumers, talk to them on their terms, don't preach to them. And finally, as far as trade is concerned, we need to learn lessons from the war on drugs, more than just the lessons that John Saylor referred to, and we really need to question whether bans are a viable long-term solution to this problem. Thank you.